Later that night, Jake sat alone on the back steps of the garage, staring at the stars. Cole joined him, 2 beers in hand. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. After a long silence, Jake finally spoke. "I thought I left that life behind." Cole took a sip, then shrugged. "The past doesn't care where you go. It just waits." Jake nodded slowly, the words sinking in. But as he looked out at the quiet town he'd tried to call home, he realized something. Maybe you can't outrun your past, but you can choose what you do when it catches up. The next morning, the garage reopened like nothing had happened. Cars came in, engines needed fixing, and life moved on. Jake picked up his wrench, wiped the grease from his hands, and got back to work. Because sometimes, the strongest thing a man can do isn't fighting the battles behind him. It's choosing to live beyond them. Balance. The leader's hand froze mid-motion, his face twisting with frustration. His buddies exchanged nervous glances, the tough guy act fading as reality crept in. Jason stayed still, his heart steady, his mind racing. The tension hadn't disappeared, it had just shifted. The leader, caught between pride and the risk of getting caught, made a split-second decision. "This isn't over," he hissed, backing away slowly. His crew followed, their swagger gone, replaced by quick steps as they disappeared into the shadows. Jason didn't relax. Not yet. His instincts told him this wasn't the end of it. Guys like that didn't walk away quietly. The security guard reached him, slightly out of breath. "You okay? What was that about?" Jason forced a small, polite smile. "Just a misunderstanding." The guard gave him a suspicious look but nodded, satisfied enough to move on. Jason watched him go, his mind still on the guys who had just threatened him. This wasn't random. Something about it felt off. Their aggression wasn't just about money. It was too personal, too targeted. As Jason drove home, the questions spun in his head. Who were they? Why did it feel like they were looking for him specifically? Later that night, as he sat in his small apartment, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He hesitated for a second before answering. A distorted voice came through the line. "You think this is over? We know who you are, Jason." And just like that, the real threat began. Jason stared at his phone, the words echoing in his mind. "Asterisk, we know who you are." Asterisk, his grip tightened, knuckles white, as a cold chill crept down his spine. This wasn't just some random college scuffle anymore. These guys knew something they shouldn't. He'd spent years blending in, leaving his past as a Navy SEAL behind, trying to live a normal life. But now, that past was catching up to him. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the dark, his mind racing through every possible scenario. Who were they? How did they know about him? His military record wasn't public. It was buried under layers of classified files. This was personal. Someone had dug deep. The next day felt like walking through a fog. In class, he sat near the back, his instincts on high alert. Every time the door creaked open, his eyes flicked toward it. Every unfamiliar face felt like a potential threat. His pulse stayed steady, but inside, the tension was building, coiled tight like a spring. Later that evening, as he headed to his car, he noticed something off. A black SUV parked across the lot, engine running, windows tinted too dark for campus security rules. Jason's steps slowed, his senses screaming. He acted casual, unlocking his car, but his reflection in the window gave him the edge he needed. A figure moved inside the SUV. He didn't wait. Spinning on his heel, he slipped between cars, using the rows as cover. His mind switched into tactical mode. No hesitation, just precise calculations. He circled wide, approaching the SUV from the blind side. As he got closer, he spotted 2 men inside, one on the phone, the other scanning the lot. They weren't just some local thugs. Their posture, the way they communicated silently, it was professional. Jason's heart pounded, not from fear, but anticipation. Whoever they weren't here for a casual warning. This was a setup. They wanted him out in the open, vulnerable. But Jason was never the prey. Before he could make his next move, his phone buzzed again. A message this time, just one photo. It was his younger sister leaving her dorm. The real game had just begun. Jason's chest tightened as he stared at the photo on his phone. His sister, Emma, oblivious to the danger lurking around her, walking out of her dorm with headphones in, backpack slung over one shoulder. The message beneath the photo was simple but chilling. Asterisk your move. Asterisk. His mind snapped into overdrive. This wasn't about him anymore. It never was. They'd found his weakness. Emma was the only family he had left, the one person he'd sworn to protect no matter what. Whoever these people were, they knew exactly how to hit him where it hurt. Tom stepped between them, his hands raised. You boys need to leave. Now. His voice was firm, but there was a hint of desperation. He'd seen Jake snap once before, not here, but years ago when some drifter pulled a knife during a heated argument outside the same garage. Jake didn't even hesitate. The fight was over before it started, and the guy left in an ambulance. No charges were pressed, self-defense, they said, but Tom never forgot how fast Jake moved, how precise, like it was second nature. But Ryan wasn't smart enough to take the warning. We'll leave when we're good and ready, he shot back, glancing around for an audience, feeding off the attention. Meanwhile, across the street, Sarah watched from the diner window. She'd known Jake for a while, brought in coffee almost every morning. Sarah watched from the diner window, her fingers wrapped tightly around a coffee mug that had long gone cold. She'd known Jake for years, never much more than polite small talk over coffee and quick exchanges when she brought in her old car for repairs. But she'd always sensed there was more to him, something hidden beneath the quiet demeanor and the haunted look in his eyes. Now, as she saw the confrontation unfolding, her instincts screamed that this wasn't just some petty argument. This was a fuse burning toward an explosion. Back in the garage, Ryan's crew was getting bolder, fueled by ego and the false courage that comes from having an audience. One of the guys, a lanky kid named Kyle, picked up a metal pipe from the workbench, twirling it in his hand like it was a toy. "What's the matter, big guy?" Scared, he sneered, stepping closer. The clanking of tools and the faint hum of an engine running in the background made the tension unbearable. Jake didn't move. His eyes flicked to the pipe, then back to Ryan, calculating. He wasn't afraid, not of them, not the situation. But he was holding back, fighting an inner battle far more dangerous than the one brewing in front of him. He'd spent years learning how to control his instincts, how to shut off the part of him trained to react without hesitation. But control has its limits. Tom's voice broke through the tension again. "You boys don't know what you're doing. Walk away while you still can." Ryan laughed, stepping right up to Jake, his face inches away. What's he gonna do? Fix us with a wrench? For a moment, time seemed to slow. Jake's breathing was steady, his gaze unwavering. But his stance shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. A shift in weight, the slight tension in his shoulders, the calm before the storm. Sarah had seen enough. She dropped the mug, the shatter echoing in the empty diner, and sprinted across the street, her heart racing. She didn't know what she was going to do, only that she had to do something before it was too late. But it was already too late. Ryan made the mistake that would tip everything over the edge. He swung the pipe. And that's when Jake finally moved. The pipe sliced through the air with a sharp whoosh, aimed straight at Jake's head. But before it could land, Jake moved. Fast, faster than anyone in the garage could process. His hand shot up, gripping the pipe mid-swing with effortless precision. The force of the blow should have knocked him back, but he stood like a wall, unmoving, his fingers wrapped tightly around the cold metal. Ryan's smug grin vanished, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. Jake didn't say a word. He twisted his wrist slightly, and the pipe clattered to the floor, slipping from Kyle's trembling fingers. In one fluid motion, Jake stepped forward, his presence alone forcing the group to stumble back. But just as it seemed like the confrontation was reaching its breaking point, a sudden shout echoed from the garage entrance. "Jake, don't." Everyone turned to see a man standing in the doorway, rugged, wearing a faded military jacket, his face weathered by time and experience. His name was Cole, another retired Navy SEAL, and someone Jake hadn't seen in years. Their past was buried deep, tied to missions neither of them liked to talk about. The sight of him was like a ghost walking in broad daylight, and for the first time, Jake's expression cracked. Ryan and his crew, confused but sensing an opportunity, regained their false confidence. "What's this?" "A reunion of old war buddies," Ryan mocked, stepping closer again, emboldened by Jake's brief hesitation. But Cole wasn't there to reminisce. His eyes locked onto Jake's, sharp and filled with a warning. "They're not worth it," he said quietly, but with enough weight to cut through the tension. "Don't go back to that place." Jake's fists clenched at his sides, his muscles coiled like springs. He wasn't just fighting Ryan and his crew anymore. He was fighting himself, his past, and everything he'd buried under years of quiet living. The garage felt smaller now, the air thick with more than just the heat of confrontation. The garage was buzzing with the usual sounds of clanking tools and revving engines. In the middle of it all stood Jake, a towering man with broad shoulders and calloused hands, effortlessly tightening bolts on an old truck. His presence was commanding, but his demeanor was quiet, almost reserved. Most people in town knew him as the giant mechanic who kept their cars running, but no one really knew much about his past. He never talked about it, and no one asked. That afternoon, a group of young men strutted into the shop, laughing loudly, that energy radiating arrogance. They weren't here for car trouble. They were here for trouble itself. One of them, a wiry guy with a cocky smirk, nudged his friend and motioned toward Jake. "Look at this big guy," he scoffed. "What's he gonna do? Crush a wrench?" The others chuckled, feeding off each other's bravado. Jake barely glanced up, unfazed by the taunts. He had dealt with men like this before years ago, in places far more dangerous than a dusty old garage. But he wasn't interested in conflict, not anymore. He simply wiped his hands on a rag and went back to work. That only encouraged them. One of the thugs stepped closer, knocking a toolbox over with a loud clang. "Oops," he grinned. "Clumsy me." Another one snatched a wrench from the counter and tossed it between his hands. "Hey, big guy, you gonna stop us?" The air in the shop grew heavy, the kind of tension that made the other customers inch away. But Jake still didn't react. Not yet. He was giving them a choice, a way out. But they didn't take it. The leader of the group took a step too far, reaching for Jake's shoulder. And in that instant, everything changed. What these punks didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly guessed, was that Jake wasn't just a mechanic. He was a retired Navy SEAL, and the skills he had once used to survive the most dangerous missions in the world, he still had them. They were about to find out the hard way. Jake didn't flinch when the thug's hand landed on his shoulder. For a split second, the garage fell into complete silence. The only sound was the faint creak of the overhead fans spinning lazily. Jake slowly straightened up, his towering frame casting a shadow over the young man who had made the mistake of thinking size was all he had to offer. His piercing blue eyes finally met the thug's, calm but sharp, like the stillness before a storm. The group of punks exchanged glances, their cocky grins starting to fade, but they weren't smart enough to back down. "What's the matter, old man?" The leader sneered, trying to cover up his growing nerves. "You think you're tough just 'cause you're big." Jake didn't respond with words. He didn't need to. His silence was heavier than any threat could be. But before things could escalate, an older man from across the garage, Tom, the shop's owner, stepped in. "Hey, that's enough." Tom's voice was gruff, filled with both authority and a hint of fear. Not fear of Jake, but fear of what might happen if these kids pushed him too far. Tom had known Jake for years. He didn't know the full story, but he knew enough. There was a reason Jake preferred engines over people. Engines didn't provoke you. They didn't test how far you could be pushed. The thugs backed off slightly, pretending they weren't rattled, but their bravado was